for 41 years following Abijah was Asa. Abijah was only for 3 years, but his son Asa took the throne and stayed there for 41 years, from about 911, 910 down to the 870s BC. So he's really an astoundingly long ruler for the country. And I guess if I were going to put a phrase for him, first let's identify where he is. He's in 1 Kings 15, 9 to 24. And then in 2 Chronicles, he's going to have several chapters of 2 Chronicles, but the most important one will be 2 Chronicles 16. And I think you're going to see 2 Chronicles 16 is a great, great story. Let me come back and say, for Asa, if I want to put a beginning point on his life, I would probably say our greatest problem is not our inability. Our greatest problem can be our own self-willed competence. Let me say it this way. When we believe in our competence, that's where we go wrong. Our greatest problem isn't our inability, it's our self-willed competence. When we believe we can do this without God, we become dangerous. So, the story is told in stereo. The story I want to look at picks up in 1 Kings chapter 15 and picks up at, say, verse 8, verse 9, and goes down into the 20s. So what I'm going to ask is that somebody would read 9 to 24, even though the story starts just a little bit before that and ends just a little bit after that. That is 1 Kings chapter 15, beginning in verse 9 down to verse 24. Can somebody read that for me?
So in the 20th year of Jeroboam, the king of Israel, Asa began to reign as king of Judah. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. He also put away the male cult prostitutes from the land and removed all their idols which his father had made. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother, because she had made a horrid image of as an Asherah. And Asa cut down her horrid image and burned it at the brook Kidron. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly devoted to the Lord all his days. He brought into the house of the Lord the dedicated things of his father and his own dedicated things, silver and gold and utensils. Now there was a war between Asa and Baasha, the king of Israel, all their days. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and fortified Ramah in order to prevent anyone from going out or coming in to Asa, king of Judah. Then Asa took all the silver and the gold which were left in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the treasuries of the king's house, and delivered them into the hand of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimmon, the son of Hezion, king of Aram, who lived in Damascus, saying, Let there be a treaty between you and me, as between my father and your father. Behold, I have sent you a present of silver and gold. Go break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so that he will withdraw from you. So Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa and set the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel, and conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Maachah, and all Shinharoth, besides all the land of Naphtali. When Baasha heard of it, he ceased fortifying Ramah and remained in Tirzah. Then King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah. None was exempt. And they carried away the stones of Ramah and Hebron, with which Baasha had built. And King Asa built with them Geba of Benjamin and Mitzvah. Now the rest of all the acts of Asa and all his might and all he did in the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? But in the time of his old age, when he was diseased in his feet, and Asa slept with his father and buried his fathers in the city of David his father, and Jehoshaphat his son reigned in his place.
Now, you get this little snapshot of a guy who seems pretty good, ends up with diseased feet and dies. And it's the rise and quick fall. Now, right next to 9 to 24, 2 Chronicles 14, 15, and 16. Because there's a 3-chapter Asa story that is going to play alongside of this. That's going to give you detail you don't have here. But let's just take a look at chapter 15 very quickly and skip a stone across the top. In 15, here's what I see. I see that King Asa was the great-grandson of Solomon, the grandson of Rehoboam, the third king of Judah. He was zealous, he was decisive, he was passionate. He overturned all that his father Abijah had done, and work to correct the wrongs of his ancestors. And in general, you see a good statement. The phrase, all the sins used of Abijah occurred 5 times in the Bible and makes its debut in 15:3. But his father and his grandfather were the only southern kings numbered with the northern kings. So, in other words, his father and his grandfather, the first 2 kings, were named like the northern kings that were all bad. I'm going somewhere with this. Here's what it says. This is the first king that he followed in the footsteps of David. He did what was right in the eyes of God in 1511. And my point is, there are only 8 kings that this is said of. So, 19 kings in the northern kingdom. How many good ones? None. Okay? Really, none. None of them followed the Lord because all of them minimally had calves. Okay? So the heartbeat wasn't Jerusalem and the temple. It was maybe they had a heart for God tenderly in some moments, but they never really followed God completely. In the southern kingdom, 8 of the 20 rulers, it will say they followed the heart of David. And this is the first one you get to see. You've been now through, this is the 3rd southern king. You've been through 19 northern kings, and this is the first time I'm telling you a good story. Now, these are real people. You see them warts and all. That is, they have good, they have bad, they have ugly. Notice in 15:12, he expels the male prostitutes, which means he rids them of the Ammonite cult. Notice that he appears, he removes the idols in verse 12 from the land. They were removed. And it's interesting because the Hebrew word was not used for regular idols. The idols were probably the latest unknown idols that his errant father had imported to the nation. In other words, he got rid of new cults in the land. The last thing that we know about him is that he had trouble, verse 14, removing the high places, but he secured the treasury of the temple. Let me just read Ray Stedman for a minute, because he says it this way, and I think it's so well said. I want to see if you can get a picture of what happens in Asa's life. He says, to put it in this present-day terms, what King Asa did was clean out the adult bookstores, close the massage parlors, confiscate all the pornographic films, close down the adult movie theaters, jail the drug pushers, restore the reading of the Bible in public, prayer in the schools and in the courts of the Lord. All the degrading, disturbing, defiling things were put away, but they were not eliminated. Legislation does not change people's hearts. It does, however, inhibit the manifestations of evil and crime and public shame and disgrace. The kingdom, therefore, entered a period of rest. A moral breathing spell was introduced by this legislation. Do you feel it? 41 years of if you're a moral person, you don't have to put up with the XXX stores blinking their lights out front of your house. You can go, okay, at least we got some morality restored to the nation. You're going to hear Christians that if they can't get a born-again, Bible-believing preacher in the White House, they're going to go, they're not going to do everything, so why should we do anything? But the symbols matter. When you raise the symbols of public shame against things, that matters. So don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't say, well, if we can't get everything, we should get nothing. Okay? A closer look at Asa, however, shows that he also was infected by something that ended up in his feet. The infection, it's a pun. And the infection was actually competency. He became too good at what he did. He read his own press, and he started to rely on his reputation of goodness rather than on his heart for God. Wait a minute. That's too fast. He started to rely on his reputation of goodness rather than his heart for God. One of the things that I love about you guys is that you started early in trying to follow God. One of the things I would caution you on is you can become the good kid. Okay, not all of you can become the good kid. A few of you can become the good kid. Some of you, you've already, nailed down the other side. But the point is, if you become the good kid, what happens is then you ride the reputation rather than the walk with God. And that's going to be important. I would like to take a look at his competence and how it became his greatest enemy. And honestly, in your life, let me tell you what it looks like. your Bible knowledge can be used against you by the enemy. Because you can walk around sort of smug about what you know about something and therefore not be hungry to learn. The best teachers are avid learners. The people that are most attractive to other people are people that are growing, not people that are spouting what they got 15 years before when they were in school. You will hear people say it and it turns you off. I know it does. You may not even be conscious of it. But back when I was in school, this is what we learned. You don't care. Okay? What you want to hear is God is at work in me and I got to show you what I'm learning. That's the voice you want to hear from. Don't be that other voice. Now, it's also easy to be doing right and then go too far. What do I mean? I'm going to take this from Dor Sherry, who wrote this, and I thought it was so well written. A person who calls himself frank and candid can easily find himself becoming tactless and cruel. A person who prides himself on being tactful can find himself becoming evasive and deceitful. A person with firm convictions can be pig-headed. A person who's inclined to be temperate and judicious can sometimes turn into somebody with weak convictions. Loyalty can lead to fanaticism. Caution can lead to timidity. Freedom can lead to license. Confidence in our competence can become our arrogance. All these are the ways strengths become weaknesses. Now, I told you earlier in the year, I think, about paired values, but watch in your life for paired values. The thing that attracts you to a man or woman will liable to be the thing that makes you sick after you're in a relationship with them. Paired values. Hardworking. What's the paired value? Workaholic. There's a wonderful sense in which they're just so happy and they're just so free. They jump out there and they'll try anything. What's the paired value? Reckless, erratic, insane. Because what will happen is when you'll come into my office and you'll say, I want to marry this person, I will say, what do you love about them? And I will make a list. And then I will tell you what your next 10 fights will be about. They're so generous, incredibly generous. Read the paired value. What is the paired value?
Not good with money.
Not good with money. Gives it all away. Okay? They are so responsible that their word is their bond. They are responsible, reliable. What's the paired value? Uptight and boring as all get out. There are people who are planned, but the paired value becomes stringent, unmovable. All of the great values that you love about a person, when you love them when you're attracted to them, and you will hate the same thing when you're in the relationship with them and it's driving you crazy. Just remember that when your kid does it, it's cute. When the kid next door does it, it's annoying. It's the same action, it just depends on the eyes you have. So all I want you to see is that you can easily go too far. Okay, can you identify words that we would write down about you? Can you then put a line and make the paired values? Okay? Do you know yourself? The good, the bad, the ugly. Do you know yourself? Okay. Let me go on and go to the Chronicles account, 2 Chronicles 14, 15, 16, because it gives you a better story of Asa, and I love his story. It's a great story. It's one worth your time. 14, 1 through 8 opens up a story about Asa. And in the first 10 years of Asa's, say 910 down to about 900, his first 10 years of his reign, he followed the Lord. And the writer notes that he did right before God. The text follows the same significant steps that we've already seen. He faced the past and reversed the wrong directions of his father. So I see 4 things he addressed. Look at verse 3, 14:3, 2 Chronicles. First, he removed foreign altars. Next, he took down high places, verse 3. Third, he smashed sacred stones. Fourth, he cut down Asherah poles, the places of fertility worship. And here's the thing. He went after the things that people envied, came to honor, came to trust, and came to look forward to for their future prosperity, he ended all those in 14:3. Now, I also see that he faced the present and he brought people back to a relationship with God. He didn't just take away. Don't do that. You can't take your child's favorite group that they like to hear because you know that it's ungodly. You can't take them away and give them a hymn book. That's not going to work. You have to give them something they see as equal value, or they're going to go right back and they're just going to hide better. So he faced the present and he brought the people back to a relationship with God. He moved distinctly in verse 4 to deal with the present walk. He did this two ways. First, he commanded the people to seek the Lord. Now that's a command, and that doesn't work by itself in verse 4. But that's not all he does. Next, he moved to the specific measurable mark of commanding people to obey the standards found in God's law. In other words, follow God, and here's how we'll know. Do these things, and this is the benchmark of how we'll know. Now, what's interesting to me is that a relationship comes with standards. Mutual love standards of a marriage make the relationship. But you can't say I love them but don't want to live with them. You can't say I love them but I don't really like them. I don't want to spend any time with them. That doesn't really work. So he faced the past and he reversed the direction in verse 3. He faced the present and brought the people as best he could back to a relationship with God in verse 4. Now go down to verses 6 and 7. It says that he faced the future and made responsible plans to defend the people. What did he do? He secured standards for a relationship with people and their God, but that was not enough. He also wanted to do some physical preparations for defense. First, he led them as they built the fortifications of Judah's city defenses, and that's in verse 6. Next, in verse 7, he wisely stopped to recognize the goodness of God. And in 14:7, you see, he acknowledges that God is doing something. Go down to verse 8. Asa prepared the people as he built up a strong and well-equipped army. So he wasn't just saying, trust God and therefore we can all lay in hammocks. Trust God, get a shield, get a sword, build up walls, do what's necessary, get ready. Why? Because he knew what the northern kingdom was like. He knew what Syria, the Arameans, were like. He knew painfully in the past, not 18 or 20 years before, Shishak and the Egyptians had come through. If we're going to be strong, we need to be strong morally, ethically, spiritually, and yes, militarily. Now verses 9, 10, and 11, a test comes. Somebody read 9, 10, 11.
Now Zerah the Ethiopian came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots, and he came to Marishah. So Asa went out to meet him and drew up in battle formation in the valley of Zephathah at Marishah. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one besides you to help in the battle between the powerful and those who have no strength. So help us, O Lord our God, for we trust in you and in your name have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let no man prevail against you.
So the Lord routed the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Take a look at this. Look at the description in 9 through 11 of the enemy, then look at the description of the believing king. For the enemy, I picked out some words. The army came from the south in the days of Shishak. He comes up, and it's a very self-reliant army. And I see if I went all the way back to chapter 12, I could see that they were a self-reliant army. But look at this. It says they came to test the new king. And they had confidence because they were vastly superior in size. They had better technology. They were not. They had technologies that weren't even available to God's people in verse 9. And so they had reason to be confident, but they did not understand the source of Judah's strength. They saw the externals, not the internals. Look, if our country falls apart, it won't be because we don't have a good military. It's because we won't have a good moral system. The greatest military in the world can't stop men from defecting on the front line if their morality is zapped from them. It can't stop our best secrets from being given away by spies when the moral fiber of the nation is depleted. So They don't understand. They see the army, and they come out of nowhere with this incredible, huge army, and when they battle against them, 300 chariots, 1,000,000 men. Judah has nothing like this. Now, switch to the believing king for a minute. Same verses, and here's what I see. I see in verse 10 that the king went out to face the problem. Do you see it? He walks right out to a 1,000,000-man army and 300 chariots, and he faces the problem. I see that he stood at the doorway of the kingdom's most important assets in the south. He saw the coming powerful army. He doesn't run. He doesn't presume on God's power, but he remains home in prayer. He turns his face upward and he calls on God. And the prayer is one of the classic prayers in Scripture. Look at the way he began. He began as he acknowledged God's ultimate power in verse 11. He starts off, God, there's nobody like you. Lord, there's none beside you to help in the battle. By the way, there's nobody else we need, but there's nobody else we've got. Okay? And then he goes on and he says, we're vulnerable. We're powerless before a mighty God. Look what he says. And those who have no strength, help us, O Lord our God. He's not coming in and saying, God, we are mighty, we are powerful, and aren't you glad to have us on your side? He's coming in going, we are outmanned, outgunned, and we are about to get rolled over if you don't do something. We don't have the ability. Absolute submission to God. We trust in you, and in your name we have come against this multitude. Oh Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against us. No, against you. We're out here representing you. We're hoping that matters. And the outcome in 12 to 15 is that they are dramatically struck down in 12. There's a large amount of plunder in 13, 14, 15. And they recover the Judahite borders, and they actually get to rout the Cushites as they're coming up. These are Ethiopians. They are people from the upper Nile. That is the Nile. When you go south on the Nile, upper Nile is actually the south part, the lower Nile is the north part. It seems reversed, but it's because the Nile's flowing northward. It comes from the mountains of Ethiopia and then goes northward, okay? So they're coming from the place where the water began. So God comes through. And Psalm 144, happy is the nation whose God is the Lord. So why is that a problem? Well, it's not until you get down a little further in the story. Go to 15 for a second. And when you read 15, you see Asa part 2. The Spirit of God came on Azariah son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, listen to me, Asa and Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you when you are with him. Would you please underline that phrase? The Lord is with you when you are with him. God is not on your side when you're against him. God is on your side when you're for him. Let me say it this way. You don't have a side that God joins. God already had a side before you were here. You join him. He doesn't join you. So let's be clear. Because we have a lot of believers walking around like God owes them to get behind their plan when they didn't make the plan because of God. They made the plan out of their own ego. God is with you when you're with him. And what's interesting, it says that's what I would call the reciprocal principle of God. The Lord stands with you when you stand with him. But there's also an absence principle. God dwells in truths he's proclaimed. When the truth isn't faithfully taught, God isn't represented, and God is gone from the scene. What I mean by that is the truth is evaporated. In the halls of Congress today, God is not being upheld in what they're saying. You can't say, well, because they're such good people. It's, are you following the truth? Where do I get that? Look at verse 3. For many days Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest and without law. In other words, God is with you when you're with him. When you're not with him, not walking according to his word, God withdraws his manifest presence from you. And if it shows up, you'll be afraid of it, not welcoming it to it. Now, there's also a sincerity principle in verse 4. Even when things are dark, a sincere search for God will be met with open arms. Look at verse 4. But in their distress, they turned to the Lord of God, and they sought him, and he let them find him. Notice how it works? Seek me. I will then let you find me. Why? Because you sought me. And by the way, in Scripture, numerous times he says, because you sought me with all your heart. When your passion becomes to know him, then he will make himself known. It is not that there's a place where God isn't, it's that you can't see him. He's at work in your life, but the question is whether or not you can see it. You don't get to see it until you seek him to see it. Let me give you also a deterrence principle. Deterrence principle, and that's in verse 5. When the truths of God are pushed aside, the fabric of society wears thin and troubles rise. It says, in those times there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for many disturbances afflicted the land of all the inhabitants of the lands. Let me just say it this way. The further we walk away from God nationally, the more disruption our government will find itself in. You're going to find more and more disrespect for all kinds of law, because the spirit of lawlessness is the opposite of walking with God. People who want to walk with God want to do right. People who don't want to walk with God want to do self. That's what they want to do. There's also a witness principle here, because one of the penalties God gives for denying his truths is infighting. But look at verse 7. It says, but you be strong, do not lose courage, for there is a reward for your work. The witness principle is this: God's intent was that believers emerge from dark days and courageously live by the truth. And when they did, the result would be the reward of the Father. You do right, and I will have you rise to the surface. Now, if that's the kind of background, look at the reforms very quickly that Asa pulls off. First, in verse 8, he removed the things of sinful influence. What am I talking about? What words are the things of sinful influence? So he starts off by saying he removed the abominable idols, right? He puts time and effort and money into things that please God. What are they? Restored the altar. He gathered with other people who wanted to follow after God. And it says he gathered all Benjamin and Judah and Ephraim, and those from the northern kingdom, Ephraim and Manasseh, who had defected from Israel to the Lord his God. People left the northern kingdom because they saw how bad it was. One of the benefits of walking with God is you'll gather around you people who want to. And the emphasis in verse 10 was on worship. They assembled at Jerusalem in the third month of the 15th year of Asa's reign. They're going to come together. And what did they do in verse 11? They sacrificed. So sacrificial, heartfelt giving followed it. And in verse 12, firm and public stands to follow God at all costs become the norm. You start to see they entered into a covenant to seek the Lord their God with all their heart and soul. And whoever would not seek the Lord God of Israel should be put to death, whether small or great, man or woman. In other words, they really lay it down on the altar. And you see God at work and moving in them. Drop down to verse 15, especially in the second half. You see that the Lord gave them rest on every side, that God honored their seeking of him. Listen, peace isn't found with the nations through negotiation. Peace with the nations is found through falling before God. And every time we go out to make a peace treaty with a godless nation, as a godless nation, all we're doing is folly. Follow God and you will find a way. God will make a way where there isn't one. He will settle people and protect your borders, but he will not do it while you're walking with a heart full of evil. And what's interesting is you get down to verses 16, 17, and 18, and the test of compromise comes during the time of rest. Look what happens. He also removed Ma'achah, the mother of King Asa, the queen mother, because she had made a horrid image as an Asherah, and Asa cut down her horrid image, crushed it, and burned it at the brook Kidron. But the high places were not removed from Israel. So you still have this little, by the way, there were still people who had their local high places they were going to, rather than going to the temple when the temple is where they should have been going. Now, here's the thing. David Swartz wrote The Magnificent Obsession. It's a great book. And he was talking about the apostles in the book of Acts, and he wrote these words. I just want you to hear them. These men did not make acts of faith, they believed. They did not say their prayers. They prayed. They did not hold conferences on psychosomatic medicine. They healed. No one can read the book of Acts without being convinced that there is someone at work besides mere human beings. Perhaps because of their very simplicity, perhaps because of their readiness to believe, to obey, to give, to suffer, and if need be, to die. The Spirit of God found in them what we must be seeking, a fellowship of men and women so united in love, so united in faith, and so committed to the truth of God's Word that He could work in them and through them, and He could do it with a minimum of hindrance. What I find is there's a real interesting statement, and it's one of the most interesting statements that you're going to read in the Bible. I want you to go in the next section, in 16. I want you to drop your eyes down, and I want you to put a box around verse 9. If it's not there already, it deserves a box. The eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that He may strongly support those whose heart is completely His. Now, that's a wonderful promise, but it comes at the moment in Asa's life when it's important for you to understand those who rise like a rocket often drop like a rock. This isn't going to be the ending you think it's going to be. But it's going to be an incredibly important story, because 14 and 15 give you a picture of Asa. What did I tell you his problem was? In a word, competence. After you have many years of doing right, and you have done the things we just read, you get older, and you read your press, and you're such a good guy. I mean, you've done it all right. And what happens? He believes it. How do I know that? Well, here's the problem for King Asa. This competent ruler, this good king, read the clippings in the Jerusalem Post, and all of a sudden, his surrender slipped away and his self-ego took over. And it wasn't easy to see, but when you get to verse 1, there's a problem. King Baasha put up fortifications to stop the flow of people and trade between them. So in 16:1, something happens. Baasha is the king of Israel. What king is he? Off of our list. He's the third king of Israel. And what do we know about him just by looking at our list without looking at anything else? What's that? He's the beginning of a new line, which means he killed the other guy, okay? So we know he's military. We know he's a coup leader. We know he blocks the traffic flow between Israel and Judah, because he has the same protective streak that Jeroboam the first had. Don't let those people go down to Judah. We also know that Asa was sucking up some of the brain trust of Israel. We know that because the righteous people in Israel were drifting south, and Baasha was going to put a stop to it. What was Asa's initial problem? His initial problem was that God had sent him a test, and periodically God will do that to help us identify growing weaknesses in our life. You can be an active, godly person, and that doesn't mean you won't have trouble. It means the trouble will indicate to you areas of weakness that you need to build on. So what was the response of King Asa? In verse 2, what did Asa do? Read verse 2 out loud, somebody.
16.
Yeah, this is 16:2, and I know it leaves you in the middle of a sentence, but read it anyway.
Then Asa brought out silver and gold from the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and sent them to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, who lived in Damascus.
Do you know what the guy did when the Ethiopians came? What did he do when there were 1 million Ethiopians and 300 chariots looking at him? He walked out, dropped to his knees, and prayed. What did he do when Baasha cut off his border? He emptied God's treasury to buy his way out. He didn't have the stomach to go out and stand in front of his people and drop to his knees anymore. Now he could buy his way out. Listen to me. When you're self-reliant, you'll justify robbing God of time, talent, and treasure, and you'll do it because you're busy doing other things. He's too busy now to seek God. And when we make bad decisions, we affect the generations behind us because we set a precedent. And the sting of the first generation's sin becomes such a common practice to the next. So here's what I want you to see. King Ahaz would later rely on Assyria, and all that happened because of what a predecessor did. He's setting a precedent that later kings are going to follow. If you can buy your way out, buy your way out. Why pray when you can buy? And one of the things that happens in our world is rather than seek God, here's what we do. We rely on our reputation of when we used to seek God, and we use plastic instead. Why seek God to meet our needs when we can whip out a MasterCard and it'll meet our needs? And the truth is, you can do that as a leader in a church and no one will question what you're doing. No one will think twice. Hey, shouldn't we be praying about this and seeking God first? No one will question that. It is so common, well, that's what you have a card for. And here's what I want you to see. He seeks whose help in verse 4? Who do you make a deal with? Ben-Hadad. Now, Ben-Hadad is the Aramean king. He goes past the northern king, Baasha, and he goes to the Arameans or the Syrians north of him, makes a deal with them, pays them off to start a war in the north to get Baasha to turn around and run the other way. He's not going to fight in the south if he's got a war on his northern border. So he creates this. Here's the thing. He goes out there and unequally yokes himself with a non-believer in order to create a problem rather than... You never read that he prayed not for a moment. How does a guy this good that did this many reforms end up like this? He became competent. But here's the problem with it. Hanani gave a message from God. Hanani comes, and in verse 7, verse 8, and verse 9, he gives a message from God. At that time, Hanani the seer, verse 7, came to Asa, king of Judah, and said, because you have relied on the king of Aram and not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hands. I would have given you Aram. I would have given you anything. You weren't in peril when Baasha came against you. If you would have turned to me, I'd have taken care. Remember the 1,000,000 Ethiopians? I turned them and fled away from you. Verse 8, were not the Ethiopians and the Lubim an immense army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered you from your hand. And these are the words that you boxed off. The eyes of the Lord run true and throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. So here's the thing. You're up against a problem. You're up against a struggle. It's bigger than you can take on. You have a choice. Your choice is try to figure out a way to solve your problem or try to figure out a way to grow closer to God. And when you try to figure out a way to grow closer to God, here's what will happen. God will give you ways to open doors to your problem that you never saw. And why did he give you the problem to begin with? Because he was waiting for you to ask, because he wanted to give you something more. So I walk away and go, wait a minute. You know, people have an unlimited capacity for thick-headedness. They really do. Even when death is imminent, they plan for the temporal and they leave the eternal on hold as if it's not coming. Do you know how many people I meet with that are like that? I mean, listen, if you're 92 and sick, you should stow your plans for what you're going to do on your house and start thinking seriously about what you're going to do when you meet God. Okay? The oldest man on earth was 122 when he died in recent memory. And honestly, you can look in the Guinness Book of World Records. Nobody in the modern world lives to be 216. So you need to get your house in order. And what they do is they paint the living room as if that's going to matter. All I'm saying to you is at some point you need to focus on verse 9. If you took some time to learn verse 9 and took some time to frame that in your life, it will pay off. I promise you.